Are Christians being targeted in Egypt? The bombing of a Coptic Christian church in Cairo has raised tensions. Will the latest attack fuel more sectarian violence? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Coptic Christians in Egypt have long accused government leaders of failing to protect them from persecution. Those accusations are now being repeated after a bomb attack in a Cairo church. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has declared 3 days of mourning for 24 worshippers who were killed during Sunday Mass. St. Peter's Church is next to the Coptic Cathedral in the capital. This is important to Coptics as the Vatican is to Roman Catholics. And this isn't the first attack against Christians in Egypt. So what can be done to prevent further bloodshed? Well, we'll be getting to our guests in just a moment. But first, here's Mohammed Val with this report.
The damage caused by the bomb attack in the Abbasiyya district of Cairo. St. Peter's was hit. It's a church right next door to St. Mark's Cathedral, the religious center for Coptic Christians in Egypt. They make up around 10% of Egypt's majority Muslim population. Casualty count is high because the church was apparently full of worshippers for Sunday Mass. Neither the Egyptian police nor the government has given any indication what caused the explosion. No group has claimed responsibility. The church attack followed another explosion on Friday which killed 6 policemen near the pyramids in Giza. That attack was claimed by a little-known group called Hasm. The Egyptian government says Hasm is a part of the banned Muslim Brotherhood movement, which insists it remains a non-violent political organization. Cairo has been calm these last months, but several attacks have targeted Christian places of worship during the last few years. The deadliest was during the last days of the rule of former President Hosni Mubarak. A bomb blast killed and wounded more than 120 people inside Al-Qaddisain, or the Two Saints Church, in the northern city of Alexandria. Some accused Mubarak's then interior minister of responsibility for the attack. In what looks like a repeat of the anger that followed that attack, protesters gathered at the scene of Sunday's blast. They demanded the resignation of the interior minister. There has been unrest in Egypt since the overthrow of its first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi, 3 years ago. The government has cracked down on political opponents and arrested thousands. Egyptian security forces also launched a military campaign to dislodge armed groups operating in the Sinai Peninsula. They've been striking at government forces when and wherever they can. Mohammed Val, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's bring in our guests now. From London, we have Carol Kirsten. He's a senior lecturer in the study of Islam and the Muslim world at King's College London. From New York, we're joined via Skype by Bishop Angelos. He's the General Bishop of the Coptic Orthodox Church in the UK. And with me here in Doha, Mohammed Al-Mazri, Associate Professor of Media and Cultural Studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Thanks very much, all of you, for being here on Inside Story. Bishop, if I could start with you. I mean, an absolutely terrible attack on Sunday, one that targeted a congregation with many women and children. What does this mean for the Coptic community in Egypt?
Well, it is obviously horrific because it was a premeditated, targeted attack to cause the greatest destruction, the greatest loss of life, at a time when people were praying and most vulnerable. We've had attacks on churches and Christian communities over the past months. Mainly they have been in Upper Egypt. This is the first of this kind of attack in one of the major cities since, as your report said, the New Year's Eve of 2011. But just one correction to your report. The biggest attack was not that. The biggest attack was the attack on 50 churches and 50 places of Christian ministry in August of 2013 after the Al-Rabaa demonstrations.
OK. We haven't heard any claim of responsibility so far, but Mohammed, I know that you've been getting some information from Egypt just in the past few moments, more information on who might be responsible. What are you hearing?
Right, well, the Washington Post and the Associated Press and also Reuters are reporting that, according to the Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, a suicide bomber was responsible. They've identified him as a 22-year-old named Mahmoud Mustafa. They've also arrested 4 individuals, 3 men and 1 woman. They're not saying anything else about motive or whether or not these individuals were affiliated with a terrorist group, but in all likelihood and based on kind of the recent history, it can be assumed that there was at least some sort of a loose affiliation with ISIS or some of these ISIS-affiliated groups that operate in Egypt.
If you're running with that assumption, how strange is it that there hasn't been a claim of responsibility, though?
Well, there isn't always a claim of responsibility, particularly in the first, 24 hours. So I think we'll have to wait for the days to come and maybe even weeks to come. But it's also possible that these are rogue individuals who are simply sympathetic to ISIS and some of the tactics that they've been employing in Egypt over the past few years.
Carol, what could be gained from attacking the Coptic Christian community, especially at this point in time?
Well, I think in this particular case, the incident is as much targeted against the Coptic community as against the Sisi regime. We saw in the reactions already that the Copts are clamoring for more protection and government support. And I think this is exactly what hardline Islamists are trying to achieve. That is to undermine and embarrass the Sisi regime and demonstrate that they are incapable of protecting their own citizens, and in addition to that, to create discord in the country and further deteriorate societal support for the current government.
Well, we're certainly going to be exploring more of Sisi's relationship with the Coptic community in just a moment. But first I want to see how the Coptic Christian minority has long complained of discrimination in mostly Muslim Egypt. Around 10% of the population is Christian. They've lived in Egypt since before the arrival of Islam in the 7th century. They suffered numerous attacks. The previous major bombing targeting Coptic Christians was on New Year's Day in 2011. 23 people were killed in Two Saints Church in Alexandria. Of course, we've just heard that there were many attacks as well throughout 2013. Coptics also face legal discrimination. Egyptian laws make it difficult to build or repair churches. A new law passed in August says governors can deny church building permits without giving any reason. Bishop Angelus, Egypt is a Muslim community. I mean, many people would first identify it as such. But tell us about the significance of the Christian community there. Bishop Angelus, Egypt is a Muslim country, and that's how most of the world would identify it as such. So tell us, give us a bit of background as to the significance of the Christian community there.
Well, of course, we all recognize that Egypt is a majority Muslim country. Our calculations are that there were about 15%, about 13 million. It's the biggest Christian presence in the Middle East and represents about 80% of all Christians in the Middle East at the moment. The significance is that Copts see themselves as indigenous people. As you said, we've been there since the 1st century, and we've lived there ever since. We've always seen ourselves as part of Egypt, and even when Islam came in, we've had our difficulties, we've had our difficult times, but we've been able to survive there, never taking up arms, never using any sort of aggression or violence. I just want to clarify one thing, that even in response to this, I don't think we've ever been clamoring for state protection. I think we expect as much protection as any other citizen. We've never wanted privileged position or status. In actual fact, we just want to focus on citizenship and what true and constructive citizenship means, which is equality in the responsibility, but also equality in accountability when something happens, that the right process of law and order takes shape.
Mohammed, do you agree with that? It's an interesting point that the bishop raises, because there is a very widely held belief, isn't it, that Christians run Egypt, at least behind the scenes.
Well, I think that there are some people that make that suggestion, but I think to the point on protection, I think this is actually a really important point. We have to remember that in August of 2013, as the bishop pointed out, there were more than 100 attacks against Christian properties. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the current president, actually ran his platform in part on security. And one of the promises that he made is that they would restore some of those damaged, or all of those damaged Christian properties, including many churches. To date, most of them have not been restored. Most of them continue to remain in ruins. And yesterday's attack, unfortunately, I think is more evidence that the Sisi government hasn't been able to fulfill one of its major campaign promises, and that is to bring security and stability, not just to Egypt's Christians, but to the community at large. There have been unprecedented terrorist attacks, unprecedented instability over the past couple of years. We're talking about dozens and dozens of attacks all across Egypt, not just against churches, but against tourist locations, against army, military, and police installations. And so Sisi hasn't been able to deliver on the security promise.
And Bishop Angelos, I mean, many Coptic Christians look to Sisi as someone who has promised security, and they've often seen Pope Tawadros, the leader of the Copts, of course, standing by Sisi's side. So they do expect some sort of extra protection, surely, from the government.
Can I just make a clarification with what Mohammed just said? I completely agree with everything except the timetabling of the churches to be restored after those attacks is in progress, and it's actually progressing. So it's not the fact that most of them are still in ruins. If we talk about the Pope being next to the President, in terms of state protocol, the Pope and Sheikh al-Azhar are always there. If you remember when the first time they appeared on that platform on the 30th of June, there were also civic leaders, there were opposition leaders. So it's not just the Pope. And as I said, we're not expecting privileged position. Far from it. We just want equal citizenship.
Carol, you mentioned before that this could be seen as an attack as much on Sisi as it could on the Coptic community. How close is the Coptic Church to Sisi? At least how close, what's the perception of how close the two are?
I don't think you have to present it in these kind of terms. The Copts are citizens of Egypt just as much as Muslims and even Jews are still regarded as such in Egypt. And they rightly expect that the government that happens to be in place is obliged to protect all its citizens regardless of their religion. So speculating indeed of special relationships is not the point of discussion. What is at stake is that Fid al-Sisi has presented himself as a law and order man and has to live up to those expectations. And it's these kind of actions, of course, that undermine that self-proclaimed role.
But just to press the point a little bit more, because there has been a public letter, hasn't there, signed by 82 Copts, and that's specifically protesting the church's support of Sisi. So what do you read into that?
Well, I think that also in Egypt, you know, the Copts is a big community. We just heard from Anba Angelos that they number in the millions, and that means that people have different political opinions. Some people might have reservations against the current government, and other Copts might find that they have to demonstrate to be loyal to the existing government. So I don't think we should also brush all Copts automatically with, or paint all the Copts with the same brush. They're entitled to their different opinions, as are all the other citizens of Egypt.
OK. Bishop Angelos, the government has announced 3 days of national mourning. What else do you need to see, or does the community need to see it doing?
Well, I think we need to see a transparent and robust investigation. There are steps, of course, there's a lot of speculation so far, as there is with any such attack. But I just hope that when the initial burst of emotion dies down, that an ongoing investigation actually clarifies what's going on. Could I just go back a minute as well to the relationship of the church and the president? I feel that Copts are sometimes dealt with as these naive, impressionable puppets that will go to whoever they need. In actual fact, the community is quite robust. It's withstood centuries, decades of persecution. It still contributes, and it still sees itself as a very big part of the country. So if a church, if a community, if a mosque, if people have a relationship with their president, surely that's not a bad thing. as long as that there is nothing untoward to that relationship. And also, if a president is reaching out, I personally, after the attacks in 2013, received a phone call in Britain from the then Prime Minister expressing his condolences. And we've seen lots of other times when state officials and leaders have done that. So I think it's very dangerous to minimize the relationship in that way. I think we need to differentiate between what the president has or hasn't done. Of course, there are attempts to undermine him and undermine his authority. We know that. And I don't think we have a blind allegiance to anyone or anything except God. Our allegiance is to Egypt and what is for the good of Egypt. And of course, it is our role as a church to look after our people. If pursuing particular roles of advocacy or relationship then safeguards those, then I think that we're well within our right to do that.
Okay, but why then are Christians being targeted in Egypt? I mean, I read here that Pope Tawadros says that attacks against Christians average 1 a month. I mean, that's a lot.
Well, Christians have been targeted in Egypt for decades now, I mean, because there has been a sense of impunity. As you said, we've seen attack after attack after attack, starting from Al-Qush, almost 30 years ago now, and going into many more attacks where we've had very few convictions. That, of course, is a green light that says to people, go for the soft target and there won't be any repercussions. So that's why I'm focusing on law and order, citizenship and accountability. There is a fringe element in Egypt that detests the presence of Christians. That is unavoidable. But that fringe element, I think, also detests the presence of Muslims who are not fully aligned with its own understanding. And that very narrow perspective then leads to an alienation of the vast majority of people. So the targeting is for people who are just intolerant of the presence of Christians. Now, unfortunately, we are a reality. We are continuing there. We have no interest to leave. And even if we did want to leave, where do you send 13 million people?
Okay. Mohammed, why do you think there are so few convictions against the perpetrators of these attacks?
Well, I think, I wrote an article last year on Al Jazeera's website, actually, about just the larger kind of incompetence that we see from the Sisi government. So I think incompetence is one reason. I don't think there's often, I wouldn't associate justice necessarily with this current government. We're talking about a quasi-authoritarian state. And I just wanted to say something in response to some of the things that have been said by the other guests. I essentially agree with the basic sentiments, but I think we would be remiss if we didn't point out that both the church, and I'm not talking about the 13 million Christians. Of course, there's tremendous diversity, right, as there is within the Muslim community in Egypt. But the church and Al-Azhar, which is the preeminent Islamic institution in Egypt, have historically been sympathetic to the ruling regime, right? We can call it what we want, but there has been a type of acquiescence, right, including silence and in some cases tacit support for repressive measures. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't point that out.
I would like to expand on that.
Well, sure. I mean, if you look at the 2013 military takeover, it was pretty clear that it was a military coup in operation. There was massive repression immediately, actually starting on July 3rd, 2013, the night of the coup. And both Al-Azhar and the church kind of stood hand in hand with the man who would ultimately become Egypt's president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. And both Al-Azhar and the church were, they offered sort of tacit support in the months that followed. They were, for the most part, silent in the face of unprecedented atrocities committed by the current government.
Carol, would you agree with that?
I would really like to qualify that much more carefully. Aside from the current incident in Egypt, I think we should not lose sight of the fact that this is part of a wider and very worrying pattern we see after regime changes, not only in the Arab world, but also in other Muslim countries. We have seen it in Syria and Iraq, where indeed the fact that there are no longer effective central governments in operation, that tensions between religions and also within religions, between people who have different views of the place of religion in public life have intensified, whether it's against Christians in Syria and Iraq or between Sunnis and Shia. We even see it in countries who have a regime change followed by relatively successful implementations of democratization processes, like Indonesia, where first tensions within the Muslim community were on the rise between progressives and reactionaries, where hardline Islamists turned on Shia and Ahmadis. And now we see in Indonesia even attempts to dislodge a Christian governor of Jakarta, allegedly for blasphemy. And once again, there also the pattern is to undermine at the same time the legitimacy of the existing government. So if you talk about support or tacit support for repressive regimes, I don't think it has to be qualified in these terms. It is the sad thing that under authoritarian regimes, minorities had a sense they were safer than they are now, either in failed states or countries that are making hesitant steps in the democratization process. So it's definitely a very big challenge, but I don't think you can qualify it as sympathy for authoritarianism on the part of religious minorities.
Bishop Angelos, that is a fair point, isn't it?
I think it definitely is, and I'm very thankful for that clarification, because democracy is a means to an end. When we overthrow governments, we need to have a plan that there is an alternative. What we saw in Egypt and other examples, as we've heard, Libya, in Iraq, now in Syria, when you have a political vacuum because of the lack of presence of a viable opposition, and that needs to be nurtured, but that vacuum creates an incredible sense of danger, and we saw in Egypt it was near anarchy. So when the church stands with a government, and you know, the word regime, the word coup, they're very volatile words that people use, but I think they have particular definitions that we may not see eye to eye on. But the government at the time was a viable government. Its absence then presented mayhem. When we looked at the change of government, we stood side by side with the new government, the elected president, but we found that time and time again, we as Christians and many other Egyptians decided they were dissatisfied. There was a call. Now, in England, if we saw things done that were done in Egypt at the time, there would be safeguards. There would be a parliament, a judiciary, there would be an ombudsman, there would be various things. In Egypt, there wasn't that safeguard. When the people called out, there was an action. Now, what developed then, and might I say, loss of life in any direction is an absolute tragedy. So I personally have spoken about that, and we have spoken about all the violations that have happened because of the concept of sanctity of life.
Okay. Mohammed, just one last point. I mean, there's been some suggestion that attacks like this are aiming to force Christians out of the Middle East, as we've seen an exodus from Yemen, Iraq, Syria. To what extent do you think that might be the case?
Well, I think, as the other guests have said, there is that fringe element that would like to see that, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. As the bishop said, where are you going to send 13 million people? And I won't go into detail on this because I know we're running short on time, but I just do want to express my disagreement with the narrative that was just expressed about 2012 and 2013 Egypt. I think that represents a gross misreading of the events. What we had is essentially a movement to undermine an elected government, and political scientists the world over warning against that outcome, and then we saw the aftermath carry itself out. And
still very little stability in Egypt, unfortunately. Unfortunately as well, we have run out of time, but thank you very much to all our guests, Carol Kirsten, Bishop Angelos and Mohammed Al-Masri here in the studio with me. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.